will share.
I have it,
presentation.
I have it up on our screen in the room. So,
Okay.
You don't need to share anything.
Okay,
Just have it on your laptop and just tell me when to forward.
sounds good. Sounds good. All right, so my name's Jim Reardon. I am from Weston and Sampson. I was the project manager from the Weston and Sampson side for this project. And this is, of course, climate resilience audit and action plan. And so I'm ready for the next slide, Evan.
Okay?
So a quick overview of the presentation this evening. So we're going to talk about the project status, and then we'll go over the final report that we have put together, which really is a culmination of all the different elements of the project as we went forward. Specifically, we'll include the methodologies we use, findings, priority actions that were identified through this project, which focus on a sustainability checklist and the specialized stretch energy code, an action table that was put together that lists out all the different actions and includes some sequencing as well as timeframes for implementation. And then some conclusions, and we'll be happy to take questions at that point and do our best to provide answers. Next slide, please. So first I wanted to give you a brief overview of what we did with this project. And I would say at this point that we're more or less to the end here with task 5. But in general, we started with a project initiation meeting where we reviewed the project plan and the methodology that we would use going forward with the project. And we'll go over that with you tonight, of course, as well. We then conducted under task 2 a regulatory audit. This was an audit of existing, please stay on that slide. This was a review of the town's development rules and regulations, resiliency audit checklist that we used to identify gaps and opportunities. And from that, we produced a memorandum. If we could go back to the previous slide, that'd be great.
Can you move his slide back?
I'll keep rolling here and
there you go.
catch up. All right, wonderful. All right, task 3 was strategic work plan sessions. We conducted, initially we were planning on doing this in 2 work sessions. Ultimately, we used 3. The first couple of them, we discussed opportunities and strategies identified in task 2. And then the third session was really talking about the action plan, and that's identified in task 4. The purpose of this was preparing an action plan based on the first 3 tasks to really give the town some guidance as to how to move forward with the different key elements of this project. And as part of that, example regulatory language was developed to help guide the town as well. And then all these things were put together in a final report and the presentation that we're giving this evening that combined the deliverables from tasks 1 through 4. Now we can move on to that next slide. So I wanted to go over the basic structure of the report with all of you. And so this slide provides a summary of what we included in that report.
Jim, can I interrupt a minute?
Sure.
Whoever's manning the Zoom, could you display the presentation instead of Jim?
I'm gonna ask
Thank
Jim
you.
to share his screen at that point.
That's it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Happy to do that.
May have to give you
I
host.
think I need to be enabled for that, though.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. Is that visible now?
Yep.
All right. So The basic summary of this report and key elements of the report. So it included an executive summary. That executive summary, of course, includes key findings from the project. We also discussed who was involved in the project from the town level, the CEAS committee, and what was included in the report. The report then goes through a narrative summary of the sustainability audit. So it essentially summarizes the memorandum that provided that audit, which is in Appendix C in the list of appendices below. I'm sorry, Appendix A in the list of appendices below. We included a table of priority actions, and these identified in particular the sustainability checklist and the adoption of the specialized stretch energy code as key priority actions, and then an action plan. And that action plan is included in a summary table that includes the prioritized actions from the audit, near and long-term timelines, responsible parties, and co-benefits that would come out of implementing each of these actions. And then there is a set of 3 appendices. I mentioned the first one already, which is that full audit memorandum. There's also a PDF of the work session materials and the draft sustainability checklist, which was one of the key actions that came out of the project. On the next slide, this talks a little bit about our methodology for the sustainability audit. And so we looked at 3 key bodies of regulatory language. Those are the Chelmsford zoning bylaw, subdivision and land. So that's chapter 202. And then the site plan and specialized permit regulations and procedures. Topics covered. So I think this is important, an important aspect of this project. We looked at a variety of areas for how development and redevelopment can become more sustainable. So we looked at the building structures themselves, how the structures that are being built on redevelopment or development site, how those can become more sustainable and more energy efficient. We looked at energy systems and standards focused around that. The site itself. So how do you make a site, or how do you locate a site or use a site in a way that is more sustainable? Public right-of-way and streets. Then we also looked at stormwater, wastewater, and water supply, how you set those up to become more efficient and to provide better treatment where appropriate. Land use, and then transportation and parking. As I'm sure you all know, transportation has a very significant carbon footprint that goes along with it. So making sure that transportation is efficient and the parking is efficient, especially given the amount of impervious surface associated with transportation and parking, is very important as well. So we looked at the results of the sustainability audit over the course of the first 2 work sessions, and then, as I mentioned, the 3rd work session really focused on the action plan and key action items going forward. So next slide. Sustainability findings. So these really fell into 7 different categories. They included sustainability and net zero design design standards for projects, low impact development and green infrastructure guidance documents. So the idea here would be to provide standards that might be included in a guidance document for developers and applicants to use as part of developing their sites. Complete streets, zoning and regulatory revisions to try and really make the whole context of development sites and of course your town more better set up to include these kind of development and redevelopment that's more sustainable. The streamlined permitting for sustainability and net zero development. The idea here is that if an applicant is coming in and saying that they're going to do these things, that you want to give them, a more streamlined process to go through than maybe an applicant that is pushing back against some of these standards. Review codes for consistency, and stretch energy code for upcoming changes. So we'll talk about this a little bit more as we move on in this presentation. But there is a new stretch energy code that's coming, which maybe some of you are aware of already, or a new addition to that, and that should be incorporated. And then exploring opportunities for promoting public transportation. The idea being, of course, if you're using public transportation, that's more energy efficient and works better for reducing carbon footprint. So next slide, please. So priority actions for implementation. These include two basic actions: the sustainability checklist and adoption of specialized stretch energy code. The sustainability checklist, the idea behind this is that when a developer is coming in or an applicant is coming in to do development or redevelopment, that they're sort of taking through those basic topic areas that I mentioned a couple of slides back, the building, the site, making sure stormwater and wastewater are managed appropriately, appropriate energy use and use of renewables wherever possible, and that they're incorporating those things into their applications, their building designs and their site designs, and so on. We set this up so that it was in tiers, with tier 1 being the most restrictive, or having the most requirements associated with it, and tier 3 being the least. These tiers have to do with the intensity of the development. So you can see tier 3 is for projects that are under 10,000 gross square feet, and tier 1 is for those kind of projects that are over 20,000 gross square feet or 20 units or more. So more in the way of major developments. And then in between there being tier 2, where between 10,000 and 20,000 square feet, or about 10 to 19 units. And that as you proceed up these tiers, that there are more requirements for you. So you have more sustainability requirements in tier 1 than you would in tier 3. As an initial step here, the sustainability checklist that an applicant would be required to fill out the sustainability checklist, but they wouldn't necessarily be required to implement everything that's in it. That's something that the town might do as they move along here. The idea being that at least with having them fill out the sustainability checklist, that applicants and the town will have an opportunity to dialogue over the kind of things that an applicant can use to improve their site. And that over the course of time, the town would apply maybe more requirements to this and require that more of these kind of things are implemented. So it'd start off as a dialogue to begin with, and over the course of time, the different elements of the sustainability checklist would become a requirement. The adoption of the specialized energy code. So the specialized energy code is in the process of being developed, and we're anticipating that it will actually be published for use for adoption at the end of this year. That's the schedule that's been set up. So we are suggesting at this point that the town monitor the development of that stretch energy code, and once it becomes available, that would be, of course, when you would make the decision on whether to adopt it or not. Next slide. So this is the overall action table for implementation. As you can see, there are a number of different actions, about 8 of them listed down the left-hand side. Each, in this table, each of the actions is just sort of listed by name, with then a description of each of the actions. The implementation horizon basically being a schedule for when things get implemented, whether that's near term or long term. And in the report itself, that has a number of years that are associated with it. Then who would be the action lead, who would support the development of that action, and then co-benefits associated with the action. Next slide. So as a general conclusion, or general set of conclusions, the sustainability audit and work sessions led to an action plan, and in particular, 2 priority actions, the sustainability checklist and the specialized stretch energy code, as well as a list of near and longer term actions. The idea here, of course, is to provide guidance for the town as it moves towards achieving net zero and improving sustainability and resilience throughout the community. And with that, I'll go to the next slide and open it up to questions or comments.
Well, any thoughts around the table?
I have a very basic question, which is, the checklist isn't yet developed, am I right?
The checklist is developed,
It is developed?
Yes.
yes.
Do we have it?
It was in the,
The 156 page
yes.
thing?
150.
Yeah, it's in the, but it's like the last page.
I'm gonna bring it up.
If you go to the very
I'll
end.
bring it up.
That's right.
I'll bring it up right now.
It's actually very
appendix.
good.
I didn't get that.
And
deep
if you'd
into
like,
it.
I can show it if you want.
I'm bringing it up right now in the room.
Okay,
Is it in our packet?
I'll bring it up on the screen.
I didn't print it out. So Jim's bringing it up as well.
I guess I would want to know what's in it before I agree to having it be part of our,
Yep.
Yeah, I think I'd want to, more than know, I'd want to digest it
Oh, of
and look
course.
at the impacts
Oh, yeah.
of it.
Yeah, there's no request of the board this evening. This is a kind of the first introduction to this concept. After this meeting, I would imagine that as time permits, the board would further engage with Badre's committee to fully understand it, workshop it a little bit more, maybe revise it, polish it. As Jim outlined in the presentation, the strategy that's in the report and that's being presented to the board for consideration is to embed this initially within your rules and regulations. What that does is it's not a requirement. An applicant can ask for a waiver, the board can grant waivers, and so it kind of sets the table to see how this, kind of view it as a pilot.
Yeah.
See how it works, see how it's received, see how it can be massaged and revised. And maybe that's a 6-month, 9-month, or a 12-month kind of pilot. Once the pilot is done and everyone's comfortable with it, the next step would be to go to town meeting and embed it for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 to make it requirements. Now, embedding it in the zoning bylaw can also allow for flexibility, waivers, deviation, part of your special permit negotiation process. So that's kind of the next 12 months, implementation schedule. Jim, you want to walk through some of the highlights of the checklist?
Absolutely. So here, I'll just back up slightly here. We already talked about this a little bit in the presentation, but there are the 3 tiers, as Evan was just mentioning.
Yep.
And they break up based on the intensity of the development that is proposed, how many units, how many square feet of gross area is being proposed. And then for each one of the tiers, Tier 1 is, again, the most intensive or the most restrictive. There are different requirements for the number of strategies that would be included over the course of time. And of course, as Evan was mentioning at the beginning, these things would not be requirements. The applicant would be asked to fill out the checklist. They'd be required to fill out the checklist and have a dialogue and a discussion with the planning board about the kind of strategies that might get implemented here. But at the point that this actually gets embedded in your regulations in a way that it's required, the proposed approach in this report is that you implement a certain number of building strategies, a certain number of stormwater management, nature-based solution strategies, transportation, pedestrian infrastructure strategies, and water conservation, wastewater strategies. And then there were requirements for energy code compliance as well. So you can see this is tier 1. And then as we move down here, tier 2, a little less restrictive for the number of building strategies and stormwater strategies. And tier 3, a little less restrictive as well. And then in the checklist itself, the applicant is required to put the name of the project, the address, where it's located, applicant information, owner information, point of contact, etc. And that's basically it. And there's the list of the types of proposed strategies that they might be including, which have to do with things like site location. They provide you with a narrative that explains how the project fits under one or the other of the tiers. How they'll implement the stretch energy code. And then the sorts of strategies that they'll use. So this is the building rating system strategies that they might be using at the site. The building system strategies, such as cool roofs, intensive green roof, green facades, etc. Stormwater strategies, whether these might be bioswales, rainwater harvesting, tree box filters, transportation and pedestrian infrastructure strategies. So some inclusion of bicycle parking, e-bicycle charging stations, etc. Water conservation, landscape design, and I think that concludes the checklist. So yeah, that concludes the checklist. So hopefully that gives you sort of a basic idea of how this thing is structured and how it's intended to work.
So Jim, what I'm not understanding is that there's an awful lot in this checklist that has to do with the building construction itself. And the zoning bylaws don't deal with building construction. I mean, that's under the privy of the building inspector. It's not under the privy of the of zoning.
And who sets the incentives? And is this checklist, what kind of incentives are we talking about? And how is it graded? Like, if they meet one or two of these, do they get, I don't know where we're going with it, is what I'm saying.
So Nancy, to answer your question, and this was discussed as part of the committee deliberations, the committee prioritized reducing carbon, the biggest bang for the buck. And so those are not traditional zoning elements, as you just alluded to. The committee identified the top priority to be the building systems. So to your point, the planning board is not expected to do a deep dive review. It will be the building commissioner who's doing the building rating systems analysis and review. Much of this is similar to other licensed professionals that appear before the planning board and submit reports to you. And under the building code, it operates the same way, where there's licensed professionals that are self-certifying compliance and so forth. So there's no expectation that the planning board itself is spending additional time on this. What was discussed is that, again, Badre's committee will likely be viewed as providing heavy assistance to the planning board to the maximum extent feasible. And as I mentioned, the building commissioner, through the building process, would as well. But it goes without saying that no one on the planning board or myself has expertise in lead ratings. I have spoken with the building commissioner, and he's described it to me the same way I've described it to you. But that's one of the primary reasons to do this pilot program, so that we can see what typical applicants are submitting. What's the level and the quality of the work based upon the projects that the planning board sees. But it's important to emphasize that the committee, who's tasked with having the town comply with the state net zero 2050 goals, did prioritize for new construction that building systems was the quickest, fastest, and probably biggest bang for the buck in reducing, carbon and becoming net zero. The other elements that are in the checklist, I think, are more familiar with the planning board, and those really aren't they're not relatively new to the planning board process. To answer Paul's comment, if and when we get to embedding this into the zoning bylaw, the strategy, particularly for Tier 1 and Tier 2, is to also incentivize it, as carrot and stick approach. What those incentives would be remains to be determined. It could simply piggyback on COID. COID allows for expedited permitting, it allows for design flexibility, it provides for reduced parking, all within usually a special permit process. So it could be viewed as simply as that.
Arbitrary, though. Very arbitrary, there's no
So,
set
Evan,
guideline.
I'm okay with
Correct.
what you're saying, but my point is that zoning bylaws, when we get around to actually incorporating this into our standards, zoning bylaws is a legitimate place to address groundwater management and landscaping and such, because that is part of the site infrastructure. But it really needs to be part of the state building code in terms of the building construction, not the zoning bylaws.
You're absolutely right. So again, to Jim's presentation and in the report, the strategy outline is that the town adopt the specialized stretch code. If and when the town adopts that specialized stretch code, then Nancy, to your point, the planning board checklist does not need to rely heavily or at all on the building rating systems. But there's no, at this point, there's no guarantee that town meeting adopts it. What town meeting adopted on the initial stretch code, if you recall, there was little or no discussion on town meeting floor. We're not certain that that's going to be the case this time around, not just in Chelmsford, but statewide. My final comment on your high-level kind of inquiry is that as we proceed, we can touch base with town council and get a legal opinion. I've been tracking some of this in other communities, and it has been a strategy to embed this in zoning. But to your point, the Zoning Act does not allow planning boards or local zoning to regulate the inside of structures, but it does allow the exterior. So roof types and other building systems. But it's a fine line that you're referring to. I just don't have that level of expertise to be able to tell you definitively one way or the other. But it's something we'll have to, you know, look further into as we proceed.
I mean, all we're dealing with is texting people, and then
Can't hear
we
you.
up with some kind of incentive, as far as I can tell. This is
Can't
kind of
hear
what
you.
I'm just
Oh.
looking at action.
Can you talk in a microphone?
Well, on the action table, there are 2 items that specifically mention the planning board.
Yeah,
Those are the 2 things I was looking at.
Right.
And then the other thing did fall into building department, was the development
yeah.
of updated energy code compliance method. But it, you know, our, what they're asking us for is very vague, in
Well,
my
I think
opinion.
that, it is vague, but I think that it's meant to be kind of a starting point.
Oh, yeah, I get that, to get information and have
Dialogue
these
and
people.
Yeah,
put it
fill
I mean,
us out.
out.
that's exactly
Yeah,
it.
I
Let's,
agree.
To the
let's just,
conversation.
yeah.
And, you know, when we talked about UMass, we asked, well, are you gonna have solar panels on the roof? And, oh, are you gonna
Prep for
do?
it.
But we were just kind of throwing stuff at the
now
wall
we
and
have
trying to
this
get
list,
stuff
yeah.
to stick. And now we have a slightly more formalized way to have a conversation about that.
Now, say if they fill this out and they change their mind, you know what I mean?
Right.
Is
that's
it
true.
necessarily gonna be put in the building? They could check everything off in that box.
Yeah, but I think going forward, I think we've got to change the way we think of it, that
Yeah.
every new commercial building in this facility, in this town, should have some level of sustainability going
Yeah.
forward.
Sure.
Even if it's tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. And I think under a special commitment, they have to make the commitment to this board, if we approve a special permit, that they're going to do a certain level.
And it would
And it would be
be,
part of the agreement.
exactly.
It would be part of it, just like we do on architectural and special permits. But I think it's the way of everything, the way it is
And
now,
to
all the
incent-
private schools, they're
Incentivize
all
it.
doing it.
Yeah, I get this, I know, I get it.
And you're in it, and,
Yeah, yeah, I
you
get
know,
it.
but they can choose which, à la carte, what they want to do, but they bring it to us and say, we are making a commitment coming into town to build this facility, whatever it is, solar array, heat pumps.
So then
They make a
it's,
commitment.
then it's based on the individual project, say, pay in lieu, you just knock some off, or, you know, it's individualized at that
Yeah, yeah,
point.
yeah.
It gives the flexibility to us,
Exactly.
but again.
Yeah, and I think
No
we should,
guidance, but
yeah, we should
flexibility.
probably be a little bit careful about getting too far ahead of ourselves. I think the key item here is to get a reasonable checklist, as much for us to gather information as anything
That's all
else.
information right there.
Get it into our regulations, which we can change any time and which we can waive any time, and which are easy to deal with. And give it, I don't know, 6 months, a year, whatever, to see what kind of results we get. At that point, I think we can probably better answer the question, do we want to
Embed.
embed this in zoning? Do we want to, remember, we could also have our own building code, too. I mean, some towns have additional building code, and there are
Oh, don't
options
go
that they
there.
stretch. You know, there are places that this could be handled. And we don't even have to decide what place we would want to put it just yet. I think getting the checklist into the package that the developer sees and fills out.
And thinks about, and
Yeah.
looks at.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then sell the benefits on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then as I've suggested, I think, you know, over the next couple of months before considering adopting into your rules and regulations, you know, meet with the Sustainability Committee. I think it's important for the board to understand what level of support the Sustainability Committee is able to offer to the planning board in engaging with prospective applicants, either before planning board submission or during planning board submission. Again, there's no expectation or commitment that the planning board itself needs to
Right.
take a deep dive on these things. As you also know, you can do peer review
Yeah.
of this kind of information, particularly if it gets embedded in the zoning bylaw and it becomes more of a priority. But I think probably the next step is to schedule a meeting with the committee, talk it over, you know, see what level of cooperation and collaboration there can be. But it is designed not to burden the planning board.
Right.
It's another ask of an applicant, but if it's in regulations, as we've discussed, it's another ask, but it's not it's not a complete burden
Right.
of an applicant. But
And
most
it's-
importantly,
yeah.
it's not overburdening the
Yeah.
planning board and asking you to take another deep dive
And-
like
and
you would on
it-
traffic or
yeah.
drainage.
It
things of that
sounds to
nature.
me as if we have a reasonably good draft of this. I guess the best way to describe it's a questionnaire as much as anything else. I would hope that we could, with minimum fanfare and maximum dispatch, be able to get that into the packages and see what we start to get. And I think we could do that fairly quickly. I would hope so. Perhaps,
Would it start at the building department? Would you get this at the building department?
well, I think that's where you start for all the paperwork anyway, or that or next door at community
As
development.
part of the meeting with the committee.
Yeah.
I think we also bring in the building commissioner.
Yep, Absolutely.
His initial thoughts as to how well he's prepared to review a lead submission. I just don't know enough about it. What I do know is that it's not new to the industry.
right.
Right.
So it's something that I think a lot of applicants and builders who are already doing business in Chelmsford, they're likely already doing it in other communities.
Yeah. So I'd suggest that we set our sights on getting that piece up and running and figure out what meetings we would want to have to
Sure.
expedite
So
that.
we have another 7-8 minutes on this agenda item. Any other questions, comments for Jim? Maybe, Badri, do you want to offer anything?
I can offer after Jim has, or
Okay.
any other questions pop up, maybe, or Dave can step up too.
Okay.
Ask a question.
Sure. Yeah, thank you.
I think it's a good start.
So, when could we get together to review this?
What I would suggest is
more.
that tomorrow I can email the committee.
Yep.
Ask them to provide some dates back to the planning board.
Okay,
If that works. But I would think within the next 2 months, 60 days, we should be able to have a meeting and maybe consider
yeah,
scheduling a planning board agenda to, for adoption into regulations.
okay, now for adoption into regulations, do we generally have a public hearing on that?
We can post it as a public hearing. It's not legally required.
But, it might not be a half-bad idea. Maybe nobody will come and makes it a short one, but giving people an
Yeah, I mean,
opportunity
we've normally done the public hearing. It doesn't require town meeting action.
Right. Okay, so it sounds like step one is a meeting with with these guys
And the commissioner, yep.
dive a little bit more deeply. And I don't imagine that's a really long affair, an hour or two. Then, when we feel we have a draft of this, we probably want to have a quick public hearing on it. And then we can, unless problems arise, we can implement it. We can implement it essentially immediately.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think,
Hey, Evan,
Yes?
Nancy. I'm looking at this checklist under water conservation, and one of the line items is an approved gray water reuse system will be installed. Do we permit gray water reuse systems?
I think
So-
not.
So this was discussed, and Jim and his team, I believe, indicated that the state DEP does allow them for very specific, limited specific purposes. But this is an example, Nancy, that you're picking up on, that we would have to verify with the Board of Health and DPW to what
Yeah, I
extent.
thought they were prohibited.
I thought so too.
Yeah, I just don't know enough about it, because it hasn't been a topic of conversation.
well, I mean, with
I
that,
would love to have one, but I thought they were prohibited,
I know, I
and
inquired
I've been
about
told
it.
they were.
Yeah, I know, like I said, I know at the committee level, it was discussed that DEP allows it, but it's very limited in Massachusetts compared to other parts of the country. Jim, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a good description. I believe they are allowed. but there are a lot of limitations around them. That's Massachusetts and New England in general, especially southern New England, has a lot of limitations on this.
Okay. All right, so you'll get something out to
Yep.
see when we might be able to meet, and
Sure. Do you have any closing remarks, David?
You have anything you want to say? Okay. Thank you all. I think a couple of points, maybe to Evan, it's not my committee, it's the Clean Energy Committee. So I want to first make
You're the
sure
chair. I should refer to you as the chair.
So I just wanted to make sure that for the record, it's not my committee. It's the town.
Apologies.
That's fine. I think, thank you for the discussions and the feedback that were raised in the initial. We are, as a committee, looking forward to working closely. I would also probably, I think, echo a sentiment, if it's not stated by the committee members explicitly in one way or the other, would like to move on this as fast as possible, to maybe borrow the chair's phrase, low amount of fanfare and maximum dispatch.
Yeah.
Do something about this, because this starts a dialogue very quickly, and the need is very, very much high. So let's aim to do some things with maximum dispatch,
Yeah.
so that we can get some things, and we are happy, I think, a subset of members will be happy to attend, collaborate, and make this happen in warp speed.
okay, well,
Thank you.
Evan, see if you
Has
can,
this been flown past the Board of Health?
No, we've started with the committee and then on to the planning board.
I think this should be reviewed by the Board of Health and
Okay.
get their
Yep.
Can
feedback
certainly do that.
before we
absolutely.
consider incorporation.
Yep.
Thank you.
We certainly will. Thank you.
Okay, Jim, thank you very much. So,
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. That's good. Does this, by the way, is this reflected in any of the master plan items that we have?
the theme, net
The
zero.
theme is in there.
Yep, net zero and sustainability is in there, yep.
Okay, because a little later on, I'll say a word or two about the master plan implementation. Okay. So that's number 3.
So now we're moving on to Jennifer Raitt, a NIMCOG. Thanks, Jim. Have a good night.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me this evening.
Yes, nice to meet you. Well, good evening. I'm Jenny Raitt.
Hi.
Hi. How is everybody?
Good, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm the executive director of NIMCOG, the Northern Middlesex Council of Governments. We're the regional planning agency for Greater Lowell. Not sure how familiar you are with us, but
Oh, yeah.
you might be receiving a lot of emails from me lately, and it's because we want to reach out to you. We want to inform you, educate you, but also provide technical assistance. We offer a comprehensive suite of assistance to our communities, which includes land use planning, housing and economic development, transportation planning, environmental planning. We've been working with Evan and his team, as well as others, the town manager, and are very pleased and excited to be able to continue working with Chelmsford. Pat is actually on our executive committee and very engaged with NIMCOG. She's also the designee to the MPO as on behalf of NIMCOG. So we have a very actively engaged set of people from the community here who participate in NIMCOG. And we've been working on MBTA communities now basically since the point in time when we learned that this was an opportunity. And if you keep moving forward, please, Evan. We understand that, of course, some of you, I know that there's a mixture of some new people and some folks who've been on the planning board, but wanted to come back and talk to you about MBTA communities, the requirements, and also kind of get a little bit of input on the locational requirements and sort of your thoughts and some early thinking about the things that you might want to incorporate into your decision-making around that process. That will help to inform a number of the next steps that we have to engage in over the, in the very near term, which I'll talk about, but then as we plan ahead over the next couple of years, because the deadline, the longer-term deadline is actually at the end of 2024. So I recognize that some of you have already heard bits and pieces of this presentation before, because I did come to a joint meeting with your board and the Select Board and the Finance Committee in September. But after speaking with Evan, as well as other planners who are working throughout the greater Lowell region, it's become very apparent that just keeping open communications about the requirements and also just getting you in the mindset of thinking about how you want to engage in these, in planning for the requirements, and also what kinds of assistance you might need from our agency is very important to moving forward. So next slide. Or the one after it, actually. So when I talk about MBTA communities, we're talking about Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 3A. This was a law that it is now state law, and it was actually a component of the Economic Development Bond Bill that was signed into law in February of 2021 by Governor Baker. And it was actually part of a suite of different types of amendments to the Zoning Act, which is basically unheard of in the history of my 25 years of experience working in land use and planning in Massachusetts. It's pretty unusual to amend the Zoning Act, which is, of course, the purview and jurisdiction of your board. The types of amendments to 40A that came through in February of 2021 were specifically to increase housing choice. Governor Baker has made a over the last 8 years, has made a point to really emphasize the importance of housing choice. And Chelmsford actually participates and is a housing choice community, has accessed multiple grant funding sources and programs as a result of its status participating in those types of programs. And the governor then made a very specific effort to also ensure that in order to advance those housing programs, some of the underlying issues with local zoning stood in the way of advancing those goals. And so with the input of hundreds of people across the Commonwealth, started to develop housing choice provisions that are now part of 40A, the Zoning Act. And those provisions basically allow communities to amend their zoning to increase housing choice by adopting things like accessory dwelling unit bylaws, multifamily housing bylaws, open space residential design, change dimensional standards and rules and regulations like parking requirements, et cetera, a number of other things, anything that could be potential barriers to the creation of housing in a community, as well as mixed-use development, and also lowers the voting threshold for special permitting of projects that advance housing choice. Basically, the overarching goal of the housing choice provisions was to lower the voting threshold, which is currently, as you know, a supermajority at a town meeting, to a simple majority, to make it therefore easier to amend zoning bylaws in order to increase housing choice. Also, in the February 2021 Act that the governor signed, MBTA communities was a component of it. And again, in the spirit of advancing housing choice. MBTA communities applies to the 175 communities that are designated as MBTA communities under state law. It actually is now, this map is showing the 175 communities, but there are 2 additional ones that have been added since, as of this month actually. So it's now 177. And all of these communities now must comply with what is known as the MBTA Communities Act, or 3A, which states that these types of communities must amend zoning at 15, to have a set aside of 15 units per acre to allow for multifamily housing, and a number of other conditions as well, which I'll talk about. So an MBTA community, there were 4 different types that were designated. Earlier this year, there were a set of draft guidelines, and some of that, sort of the typology of communities changed over time. And so in August of this year, the final guidelines were issued by DHCD. They've been very modestly adjusted since that issuance of those final guidelines. by allowing for affordability to be incorporated more purposefully. But that's why I came in September to provide a presentation about what the final guidelines spoke about. So if you'll go forward. So the MBTA community requirement is such that you have to provide for at least one district of some nature or some area of a reasonable size in which multifamily housing is permitted as of right. And multifamily housing cannot have any age restrictions. It must be suitable for families with children, and it has to have some sort of reasonable size. And in the state law, the reasonable size mentions that it must have that minimum gross density that I mentioned and some locational requirements. DHCD defined the terminology relevant here that's in bold on the screen in the final guidelines. Next slide, please. So what that means in Chelmsford is that, again, the typology is such that I'm going to go name the community types so you understand them. The first type is a rapid transit community. There's about a dozen of those types of communities that are mostly in and around Boston. Then you have the commuter rail communities, which have a clear, direct connection to a commuter rail station or location. So in the NIMCOG region, Billerica and Lowell are designated as commuter rail communities. Then you have many communities that are considered adjacent communities, which means that they have some adjacency to transit, but are predominantly oriented around a bus system. The bus system could be an MBTA-serviced bus, or it could be provided by the Regional Transit Authority. In our case here in Lowell, Greater Lowell rather, we have the Lowell Regional Transit Authority, which is the LRTA service that is provided directly to Chelmsford. In fact, routes throughout town relate back to the LRTA. The next type of town and typology is a small town, an adjacent small town. And those types of communities, there's one adjacent here, those types of communities are basically deemed as smaller, and they have some adjacency and some limited bus service as well, or no service, but the ability to have like a ride, some sort of hop on and kiss and ride, or those types of services where people can, basically get on some other, it could be a private system or something else that brings them directly to the transit system. And then there are communities that don't have any service at all. And there's actually 2 of them in the NIMCOG region. So we do have a range of communities that are in this region. Chelmsford is considered an adjacent community. And based on that community typology, the state in the final guidelines deemed certain types of capacities that are based on the density and scale of the community. And so based on Chelmsford's 2020 number of total housing units, which is on the screen here, that meant that the minimum multifamily unit capacity district would need to have this total volume capacity of 1,477 units, or 10% of that total. The minimum land area coverage also must be at least 50 acres. The district, however, in the location, initially there was, in the draft guidelines, the location requirements were, very specific to a location around some sort of stop. But in the finalization of the guidelines, it was deemed that, especially in adjacent communities, it made more sense to look at other potential opportunities for the location of the district. So the district still has certain requirements, including that it must be at least 5 contiguous acres, but it is recommended that it is in location with some sort of neighborhood scale or district along a transportation corridor, near a commercial area, et cetera. It cannot be in a single development site where there might just be an interest in developing that particular area, though. Next slide, please. So when I talk about 15 units per acre, I just like to put this slide up so that it's clear what we're talking about. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the type of housing that we're really talking about here. How big is an acre? It's 16 tennis courts. It's 1 acre is about almost a total amount of an American-sized football field. It is kind of a large area, relatively speaking, even though you might have a lot of acre-sized zoning. 1 acre actually could fit a number of different housing units and housing typologies. Next slide, please. And by that I mean, when I say multifamily housing, something might have popped into your mind that already exists in town, or something that you reviewed, or something that another board in town might have reviewed along the way. But in this case, multifamily housing is defined as a building with 3 or more residential dwelling units, or 2 or more buildings on the same lot with more than 1 residential dwelling unit in each building. So that is actually the definition under the state law of what multifamily housing is. And what that ends up meaning in terms of the definition and the applicability to land and land use is we're really talking about everything in the middle. Have all that sort of housing typology that may or may not be particularly prevalent here in Chelmsford, but actually fulfills a very specific need for housing that you do have in Chelmsford based upon your housing production plan, which was recently adopted, and also spoken about in your master plan, and that is called missing middle housing. Next slide, please. So some additional things related to this sort of typology and what we're talking about. The MBTA communities law is there's a lot to talk about in order to get this type of zoning adopted, but it will help the town to maintain eligibility for a range of state programs through what's called a one-stop application process, and it applies to a number of those types of programs that, as I mentioned, as a housing choice community, you have been routinely accessing those awards. And in fact, I think we're just recently awarded funds through the state for such programming. You would no longer be eligible for those funds if you did not maintain and meet the state law requirement. So it is a legal requirement in that way. It is also stated in your master plan that you wish to maintain eligibility. So it's clear that the community feels strongly about leveraging all of these additional funds, which makes sense because it provides for a clear balance between what you can afford locally and what you can ask your residents to pay for locally versus what you want to leverage in revenue that helps to get projects done. Projects like infrastructure or things that help economic development, addressing water and sewer, all of those things are intersected. It also helps you to meet your land use and zoning goals by directing growth in specific locations that you have stated again in that planning document that you wish to achieve. The housing production plan also talks about a number of different strategies and recommendations to help people who are renting, help people who want to buy new housing, and things that apply to a diversity of people needing to access housing in the community, or people who currently have needs in the community that are not being served. Of course, the last part is that it helps you to keep ahead and be really proactive rather than risk non-compliance. And my observation of Chelmsford is that that's what you tend to do. So it would actually be in keeping with what you've done historically. It does have a pretty strict timeline for moving forward, but as I just complimented you on your strategic proactive thinking, your director has already been strategically looking ahead and planning for some of these goals, like the most immediate near-term deadline in January to submit an interim compliance action plan to DHCD, or to submit something to the state that may potentially look like it's compliant already with the law, which is something that might happen as well. That would happen in the interim. But over the course of the next couple of years, because by December 31st of 2024 is when you need to be completely compliant with your zoning. Over the course of this time period, you will likely need some assistance either from NIMCOG or another entity in order to move forward, to have some public engagement, including a planning process to develop the zoning in the district. And you also need enough time to build in to allow DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development at the state level, to review this for any draft of anything for compliance before it heads to a town meeting. And you might get a run at a couple of town meetings before you're satisfied. That might be the case as well. At any point in time, though, your board can start looking at materials on the state's website at mass.gov/MBTA communities. Everything I'm talking about this evening is all posted on that website, including numerous technical assistance and guidance modules about different components of the law and how to comply. Next slide, please. Our role at NIMCOG is really both one that's helping regionally and then also directly helping provide technical assistance when needed. So we're assisting with everything from compliance modeling, to mapping, to data analysis, to looking at old, other reports or studies that you've done about types of development. We'll be happy to convene additional meetings. We'll help you with any meeting milestones. And we're also going to begin the development of a regional housing strategy. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pause before I head into this to see if it's okay, Evan, or Chair, for any questions.
Run it around? I know I've seen some of this before, so it's not completely new.
Yeah, Jen, what is considered substandard conditions? You had a slide that said 3.7% of occupied housing units in Chelmsford have substandard conditions.
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. I breezed right through that slide, so thank you for reading it and asking the question. That statistic came from the Community Teamwork, Inc. Community Housing Needs Assessment Report that they do, community needs assessment, I'm sorry, I added the word housing. It's actually comprehensive in terms of the types of needs that they look at. Housing is one of them. And they do this report every 3 years as part of their general programming and understanding of communities that are most in need. Substandard housing means that it does not have some sort of facility in it. It could be lack of a full bathroom, could be a lack of full cooking facilities. So I don't know specifically what the conditions are here in that percentage of housing units, but it means that it is lacking one of those types of core components of a healthy, safe, livable home.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so what does it mean to diversify housing? I've got a whole bunch of examples of what it looks like at different densities, so I'm going to just run through it, and maybe you've seen some of these places. So we're going to take a little trip around Metro Boston mostly, but these are communities that all of them are suburban communities with different types of land uses, but some of them look very similar to Chelmsford in terms of land use and intersection of commercial or industrial, highways, and residential, dense, or smaller residential neighborhoods. Linden Square in Wellesley is right on Oak Street off of downtown Wellesley, but in close proximity to a lot of other types of land uses, including protected lands. It is 64 housing units at 12 units per acre. This is the only example that doesn't give 15 units per acre, so bear with me. We're going to get more dense as we go along. But it's showing you that as you get more densities, you do get sometimes different types of square footage of the general average square footage of a unit, but it'll also begin to show you the price points sort of change over time. You might look at this price, though, and say, that's still very high. This is Wellesley. So for Wellesley, this range of ownership is quite good. It's meeting that missing middle, that $500,000 to just under $1 million price point at that particular point in time. And this is the typology that it looks like. You can keep going forward. On the ground, as you can see, it's basically a 2-story building with courtyards and public amenities, sort of a public realm sort of feeling, and gathering spaces, walkways, lighting, infrastructure, landscaping. In Situate, on Front Street in there, downtown, there's a place called Harborside Village, and it is 34 housing units at 30 units per acre. It is a combination of 1 and 2 bedroom units, and it's 3 stories tall. The range of square footage is 875 square feet to 1,700. It is also for sale, and again, at that price point, the 300 to 500,000. Try looking for a unit at that price in one of these communities. It is not easy to find, but as you build more densely, you do end up changing the price points quite a bit. And this is what it looks like from the street.
So I just have a question. So it doesn't have to be apartments, rental units. It can be ownership, condominium
It
type.
could be owner or it could be rental, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. The next example is in Concord. It's called Brookside Square. It is 74 housing units at 17 units per acre. It is studios to 2 bedrooms, 3 stories tall. And it is 518 square feet, again, a studio, to 1,000 square feet. And these are rentals, and they range from $1,600-ish to $3,100. And it looks like this. It is also LEED. It has a lot of sustainability elements incorporated into the design. It's actually quite very ahead of its time, sort of forward-thinking, sustainable development. Landscaped. There's a river walk type of area nearby. It's also close to the train. All of these are actually in close proximity to some sort of transit. 30 Haven is in Reading. This is also in their downtown. It's 53 housing units at 68 units per acre. Also rental units that are 1 to 2 bedrooms. This is the tallest of all of them. This is 4 stories. And the square footage range is from 750 to 1,400-ish square feet. Next slide. It shows you sort of the division. It's a mixed-use development. Mixed use is allowed under this law, but you have to also include multifamily housing by right. So that's what it looks like on the ground. Real variety, again, of building materials and types. Obviously, storefronts as well in that particular case. Market Street Apartments is in Linfield. Linfield, this particular area, you may have seen it from Route 128. If you've ever driven by in Linfield, it looks like mostly a commercial area. And you might think, you may not have realized that it actually is, it was a 40R, which under state law is Mass General Law 40R, is a smart growth overlay district. This is the Market Street Apartments, but there's also a senior housing development that's adjacent to this, as well as that very dense commercial area that's been developed, which is somewhat the Market Street retail that's shown here. It looks a little bit different than the others. It is a different type of development. And
by the way, this is my son's favorite market area. He goes there all the time. He's always talking about it.
Yes, they have a lot. The commercial area does have a lot going on. So there's many things. It is an excellent place. It's basically a new neighborhood in Linfield. It didn't exist previously. It was near a golf course, and I think there was a Holiday Inn. The Holiday Inn, I believe, is still there, but it was repurposed into Market Street, and it's been quite successful.
Yeah, no, my son, he's 16 years old, and he keeps telling me, why don't we just change 129 to look like something like that, Mom? They did a great job.
It took some time to get that passed in Linfield, but I think the outcome has been nothing but success for the community, for the tax base, and definitely for the people who get to live there. And of course, shop and play there. So I appreciate that point. So I was invited to talk, first I was invited to give you a little sort of the background and the history and get you up to speed, and hopefully I've done that. To give you some sense of density types of examples when we're talking about this, what are we talking about? What does it potentially look like? We have done a little bit of sort of analysis of what you have going on already, and it may or may not be slightly compliant with the law. We'll figure that out along the way in assistance to the town. But I was asked to attend this meeting tonight to talk with you about some preliminary strategies and what that might look like here. So with that in mind, one way to kind of start this conversation, I did actually bring this map, but I'm not sure where this would happen.
So can I ask you one quick question?
Oh, yes.
Does the property have to be on, let's call it a bus route? Does it have to be adjacent to a bus route?
It does not have to be,
walking
but
distance?
what they're encouraging you to do, well, let me back
They
up
did
for a
want
second.
it a half a mile away at first,
Oh,
right?
right, initially the location was very specific, but then it actually said if applicable in the law. And they took the if applicable and made that into where you think, based upon a master plan or some comprehensive vision that you have for the community, where you think you would want to see development go over the course of any number of years. There's not a timeline for developing the housing. All there is a timeline for passing the zoning and making sure that you're compliant in having a district in place and having the capacity to build in those zones. That's the key part. It does not have to be adjacent to or on a bus route or adjacent to a bus stop, but that's what you see here on the screen. That's basically what those stops are and what the lines are. I think if you move to the next slide, that's just showing, sort of what it looks like in the bigger picture of the community. And I also made a map that's only here that is showing you, giving you a sense of what we would call a walk shed, which is basically a certain amount of, a certain distance from one point towards that bus stop that you could walk comfortably to get to that location. So I do have something like that that can help get you thinking about it. The purpose there is for you to just sort of think about bigger picture. Where would you see the best opportunities for this type of development occurring? And to be able to kind of think about what your priorities might be for multifamily housing. So I've kind of like got a little list here that I started for you to get the conversation rolling. And some of this aligns with, again, things that are already in your master plan, already stated as things that you would like, as well as in the housing production plan. But I think we wanted to kind of get a sense from you if there's some preferences or priorities that might be helpful to understand as we at least just move forward in this interim period. This does not in any way eliminate further public engagement. This is simply a starting discussion to get a sense of your priorities. So I'll pause.
So the deadline is just to have a plan in place.
An interim, action plan. And by action plan, it simply means you've reviewed the requirements, you have certain planning documents that demonstrate your interest in housing, you are thinking ahead to a future town meeting, and these are the steps that you will need to take. These are elements that are important to the town that we will be considering as we start to develop the zoning. And these are kinds of things that we're also concerned about, like where we might need additional support. So, for example,
That's done, right? Evan already has that.
No,
No.
it's something we've, talked about and are exploring, but it is something that we will be.
So-
That's the January 31st
So I
deadline.
gave you the hard copy of the action plan. What we're focusing on now is section 3. So to Paul's point, I could have filled this out and then presented a draft to the board. But if you look at Jennifer's slide here, like the last bullet, distributed versus focused. So the town, just take that one bullet. 12 years ago, when Chelmsford was in the midst of the 40B height, the plan production plan, our first generation plan production plan, had a distributed strategy. And what do you think happened? Developers came in proposing 40Bs scattered throughout town. Well, these were in close proximity to neighborhoods, and that turned out to be a nightmare. So then the second generation housing production plan talked about concentrated. Find sites and properties in town that can accommodate high density so that we can get the biggest bang for the buck and comply as quickly as possible and not disturb as many single-family neighborhoods. So that's a strategy that we've been on for the last decade. And that's exactly the way it's been built. It's been embedded into the master plan. And then we finally evolved that into mixed-use zoning within our existing commercial corridors along numbered state routes. So that's really what Jennifer and I are hoping we can get some general feedback from the planning board on so that we're able to submit this action plan. Now, if you look at section 3, the general questions are fairly high level. What the state's looking for is some indication that there's been some initial community discussion and engagement with staff, with the stakeholders that are going to be responsible for further implementation over the next 2 years. So at a minimum, in order for me to be comfortable and hopefully in order for you to be comfortable submitting this, we at least need to be on the same, at the same table, talking the same strategy. And I think that's the primary goal tonight is, begin to identify clear guiding principles, and then maybe that leads to being able to identify particular properties or general geographic areas. The more specific we can be, the easier it is for all of us to, talk the same language and then communicate that over the next 2 years via strategy and implementation.
Evan,
Yes?
just a fast question. I may end up losing power here, it's been blinking. But when you say the draft, did you send that out or did you hand it out in hard copies tonight?
I emailed the action plan. I did not fill anything out. I just emailed out, several days ago. I emailed out a copy of the action plan.
And this
So,
was
so
Thursday.
you sent the template or
Yes,
the
the template,
questionnaire?
exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
And I just want to say, this action plan document, if there's anybody interested in looking at it, the same exact thing that we're looking at right now is on the mass.gov MBTA Communities webpage. And you literally can click on the action plan, and it will be this exact document in blank format, not submitted, of course.
Right, and so, just to start off in section 3, their first question is, do you contemplate using existing zoning districts? Or do you contemplate creating new overlays, new base zoning districts, or other zoning strategies?
All the above.
So it could be all of the above. It could be something as straightforward as piggybacking on existing overlays and acknowledging that those are town-wide, or it could be creating a new overlay that's even more focused and more specific.
Everything.
And it may be easier to come to that conclusion after identifying general geographic areas or specific areas. And as Jennifer indicated, the plan production plan provides some guidance on that. The master plan provides additional guidance on that. And then obviously the planning board and other committees in town, may have even more specific or updated ideas.
And if I might, my recommendation to you would be to likely select all that apply for now, so that you're in a starting place with the community of exploring all the possibilities because of the acreage that you might need in order to meet the capacity. It might be wise to just simply, for now, select all. Again, this is not committing the town to
Correct.
all of those locations. It is simply saying we are going to explore all the possibilities, including how we might amend base zoning and other things.
I have a question about the 50 acres, because when you read these, it's very hard to follow 1 to 2 to 3. It all leads to 100 acres, I thought I was,
I had presented 100 acres
okay.
back in
But it's down to 50
back in
now.
April, I believe. No, the reason I presented 100 acres is that if the town wanted to replicate UMass West, that's a big assumption. But if you simply wanted to replicate UMass West, it's 25 developable acres at 15 units an acre, brings you to 390 plus or minus
We need
units.
1477.
Correct, so you'd have to duplicate
We
that.
do need 100 acres.
You'd have to do, yeah.
To get 15 per acre, you need 100 acres.
Yeah, exactly.
It ends up enlarging the area that
So
you
that you were
zone
just
for,
being
but it's.
pragmatic about it.
Yes.
Being,
It's pragmatic, but it's also, depending upon the strategy, it's not difficult to find 3 or 4 other 25-acre
contingent 5
areas. It doesn't
acres.
have to be contiguous.
Well, the 5 acres
Yeah.
has to be,
Not as a single ownership. It could be as simple as that.
okay.
And as the spirit and
And it
intent of
doesn't
the,
have,
what's that?
we don't have to necessarily build on it, or.
No,
Wait.
no.
We're all,
You could just say, like, for instance, this is just like you could say the 129 area, that whole area
Yep.
yes, you
could
could.
also be dedicated for this.
Yes, you
And
could.
it already is, though. So we've already been moving towards
Yeah,
that goal.
yeah, the only thing with 129 is we would have to do a little bit of tweaking that permitted up to 15 units per acre by right, as opposed to special permit. But that's
Correct.
doable,
Correct. I think Anita was talking about just location.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I would certainly consider
the
the,
location.
Sure, and it could be as simple as that, exactly.
It could be, and it could be as simple as putting an overlay on the lower part of 110, where we already have multifamily housing.
Exactly.
Okay, yep.
So that's
Okay.
this phase.
Who's gonna help us with that? Are you helping?
Yeah, through the technical assistance.
We will
right, we're gonna have a
be providing
meeting.
technical
Yeah.
assistance. Yeah.
Is there a deadline that we have to have the 1,400 homes built by, and is there a date down the road?
Not at this point in time,
There's
no.
not.
The only thing that you need to do is zone
Zone for it.
for it
To allow
and to that
developers to come in.
capacity.
Yep.
So,
Yes.
Well, we have no control over the building. All we can do is zone for it.
No, I
Well,
know
it
that, but I
still
didn't
goes
know
through.
if the state said it's gonna be 10 years, you have to have this in place.
That has not been communicated
No,
at
but
this
the
time.
one thing we do need to get done is you can get that out to them and
well, yeah, but
look at the initial
I'll,
communications done.
yeah, I mean, I'll probably create a draft and then bring it back to the
Yep.
planning board. We'll need to do this by, January 31st, so our deadline will be your second meeting in January.
Okay.
Kevin, question? In that the towns have no control over investors' activities, could the state even consider dictating that it had to be built out by any given time?
I mean, as Jennifer's
We have no
indicating,
way to make that
that's,
happen.
that's not on the table right now.
Could it ever be?
I mean,
Way too much pushback.
they do have planned production through, the planned production plan, so the concept is somewhat there, it's not a completely foreign concept to the state. But that'd be a big leap to require
I mean, where would the money
production.
come from to do that?
Well, that's a good point, and Jennifer
Unless we're
can
gonna
speak
have
more to
public
this.
housing.
The MMA, as well as the Mass Planners Association, and a lot of other organizations that provided comment into this process, kept reiterating to the state that it's fine and dandy to ask communities to zone for the development, but many communities eastern Massachusetts literally don't have the infrastructure to accommodate the development, even if they wanted the development.
Well, that's true too, is
So-
we can't support the
So
development.
the message to the state has been, simultaneously, you need to provide increased infrastructure assistance if you want these units to be built. And that's exactly where a community such as Chelmsford happens to find itself, setting aside the political will to actually build units. But I think generally.
Besides the fact that people don't want them built, the fact is we don't have the
Well,
infrastructure to support it.
Right.
So as it sits right now, we just have the zone for it. Simple as
We
that.
just have to zone for it.
Correct.
That's right.
Correct. I mean, it goes without saying that the state, and I think everyone else knows, that if you zone it and it's by right, you will receive more applications. And then, as development in Massachusetts works now, if the public doesn't have the infrastructure in place, developers have the legal right to provide their own or extend municipal systems. So there will be increased applications, and then it all comes down to the local economic viability. And that's on a case-by-case
If it works for
basis.
Chelmsford, it works for Chelmsford.
Yeah, sure, that's why I think Jennifer is suggesting, and I completely agree, that while we can make this as simple as we want, we may also want to be fairly strategic. Because it's likely that we will get some applications.
Right.
And just to add to that, you have a need for housing.
We do.
You have a demonstrated
We do.
need for people who need housing here in Chelmsford, in the broader region. And just looking at zoning over places that are already developed, I would say it might be wise to look at those other locations that aren't yet developed or that have development opportunity or redevelopment opportunity, because we're talking about different types of housing. We also don't want necessarily to displace people who are already living in existing multifamily buildings in this community by way of redeveloping them, or expanding upon them. You might want to think about that a little bit as well as you're moving forward, especially from an equity perspective. Looking at
Jen-
this more comprehensively is important.
Those projects.
Jen, the concern is that if you're talking about places that aren't already developed or that badly need to be redeveloped. The only place that I can think of in town that qualifies is in a flood zone.
It's in a flood zone.
It's in a flood zone. It's in a floodplain.
And we're not talking about development in any of those types of locations. That
Can it
wouldn't
be-
actually be qualified as developable land under this law as well, so.
It
Well,
can-
I understand that, but my
Cannot.
point is, we don't have the land to develop.
And all I'm suggesting, I'm not looking at the land as it exists right now. I'm talking about that as part of a planning process, we want to be looking at any opportunities that do exist right now and what we might want to see in the future. And that's mirroring what your master plan is already saying. Not to develop in the areas that you had just noted though, Nancy, of
There's
course.
not enough developable acreage in town.
Right, but to Anita's,
To even-
to Anita's
to even come
point,
close,
you
so
know,
would have to be
Anita's
redeveloped.
scenario would reimagine 129.
Reimagining,
The whole mall.
right.
That's
Knock
right.
it down,
Yeah,
the whole
right.
mall, knock it down, put an Avalon.
So just as we're wrapping up here,
Yeah, I mean,
I
you're
just,
talking about knocking something down.
yeah, redevelopment, you know, in accordance with your, you know,
Yeah.
your
Back to
planning
Chelmsford
documents and
Mall.
your zoning bylaw. So just as we're wrapping up here, I brought up the missing middle housing. And I know this concept isn't really articulated in the regulations. I think some board members recall that the Center Village Overlay District, we have a table that kind of incorporates some of these concepts where we have graphic images showing different types of housing styles. So I guess food for thought, I wonder to what extent towns who are implementing this zoning, to what extent they're able to articulate zoning that results in specific or certain types of housing types and not others. I asked that question, we don't have it, I'm not sure what communities do have it. But if Chelmsford wants to move away from typical 40B central corridor, multi-story housing, maybe we have enough of it, and we want to encourage, you know, more fourplexes, courtyards, cottage, we may need to figure out a way where the zoning words result in that. And I just don't know to what extent we can do that or how we would go about that.
Like Linfield, that looked beautiful. Linfield, you know, we're pretty much like a Linfield. We used to be a Linfield.
Want to see
We
the
used to be a
picture of
farm
Linfield again?
Yeah.
And that was done on fairly short acreage, right? Like
It's
one of
not,
those was
yeah,
on
it's
an
a very
acre.
large
One was on
area, so
less
that's a
than an
very
acre.
small.
One owner at the golf course.
Yeah, they had a golf course, yes.
So,
It used to be the old
so when
colony.
you do
Yeah,
this
what was that
zoning,
golf course
It's cool.
called? Well, it was, had another name though.
Then it had it had the country club there. They had all the,
Yeah, yeah.
I had a prom there years ago.
I thought they said it was next to the.
so when you do this
Yeah, it is
by
next to it,
right
yes.
density zoning, can you specify the type of housing that can be put in it?
I just asked that, I think we're gonna
Yep.
look into it.
And I was going to answer that, yes, we could specify the type of housing that we're talking about, as long as it meets that density requirement and eventually fulfills some sort of capacity requirements.
But you have to do more than just a
Right.
name or a title. You have to create regulation, zoning regulation.
Of course.
That defines it, so to speak.
And have it be
Yeah.
relevant for your
Yeah,
current
and like I
zoning
said, I think
bylaw,
the
obviously.
Village Center Overlay District may provide inspiration as to how we
Those are
jump.
the definitions right there. We
Well,
can
they'll-
pick them.
Yeah, but you have to further define them with words.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so this was good for tonight.
Okay,
Yep.
good.
I will circle with Jennifer, we'll create a
Okay.
draft, and then we'll bring it back to the
Sounds
board.
like a plan.
Excellent.
Second,
Thank you.
second meeting in January?
I'll let you know.
Yeah, okay. All right,
I'll let you know.
excellent.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
so
much.
much
Thank
for your
you.
time.
you.
And please feel free to get in touch anytime if you have questions in the interim through Evan. Okay, you're welcome. Good night, and I'll just.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so the third item tonight is back to Weston and Sampson, Jerice Schwartz, and I believe one other member from Weston and Sampson are here. Jerice, why don't you introduce yourself, and you're on Zoom here with us.
Hey, great. Thanks so much, Evan. And thanks so much to the board for having us here tonight. My name is Jerice Schwartz. I'm with Weston and Sampson. I'm a stormwater team leader at Weston and Sampson. And I have with me tonight Thea Raymond as well from our office.
Yep, there she is.
Hi, everyone. I'm Thea. I'm a project engineer.
Yeah, so Evan, we had put together obviously a little PowerPoint presentation for tonight. So I don't know.
Yeah, I have that on the screen in the room. Board members have hard copies. If you want to share your screen, that's fine as well.
Okay, yeah, I can do that.
Let me just give you,
Permission.
okay.
All right, we can locate it here quickly. There we go. We just do that. Wait, is everyone able to see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, so we're here tonight just to talk about the street design and parking lot report that we prepared for the town. And this is all related to compliance with the MS4 permit. And I'm assuming everyone's pretty familiar with the MS4 permit, but it regulates stormwater discharges from the town's municipal storm drain system. This permit's obviously been around for a while. We're currently in the second iteration of the permit that has a lot more extensive requirements than were covered under the previous permit. And recently, there's been a lot of requirements related to updating stormwater regulations in town, which the town has already undertaken. So I'm assuming you guys have some familiarity with that. I think the town engineer has come before the board to make updates to the regs in the past. And the regulatory updates around construction and post-construction stormwater management. And so there are kind of two pieces to this post-construction stormwater management requirement. And it's looking at developing a report to assess current street design and parking lot guidelines and other requirements as they relate to impervious cover. There was also a separate green infrastructure analysis required as well, which was previously done already, I think, by the town engineer. Some updates were suggested to various town regulations, and I believe those updates have already been adopted.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, and that really has kind of streamlined this process as well, because there is some overlap in terms of some of the items that we look at as part of this regulatory update as well. So the goal here was to identify areas in the town's regulations and design standards where changes could be made to support low-impact development, green infrastructure, and where we could reduce impervious cover in street and parking lot designs. Obviously, with the goal of reducing impervious cover, allows more stormwater to infiltrate overall, resulting in an improvement in water quality. So there were various regulations that we reviewed as part of this process and various policies. Pretty extensive review, like we talked about, and also review the most recent updates that incorporated the green infrastructure report requirements as well. So that was all kind of built into this analysis. We developed a list of key questions in the categories of streets, driveways, parking lots, and sidewalks. Again, all items that relate to impervious cover. There was a number of questions that were posed. We developed, if you've read the report, there's an accompanying matrix as part of that, where we looked at different key questions relating to minimum residential roadway width. Is there an opportunity to reduce that minimum? Are flush curbs, curb cuts allowed currently? How does the town feel about, what's the statement on shared driveways or shared parking areas? Are those allowed? Is permeable pavement allowed and under what circumstances? And so for each of these key questions, we rated them as conventional, better, or best, using a system based on the regulatory assessment tool developed by Mass Audubon. And in areas where there were recommendations that were rated as either conventional or better, we recommended improvements based on that language if it wasn't rated as best. And we looked at this across all of your regulations. So in some cases, some of the regulatory language included might have been rated as best already, where we wouldn't have recommended any improvements, but maybe based on a similar, item or area, we might have recommended improvements to other regulatory documents. So maybe in that case, it was rated better overall, because some updates were needed in that particular category. So this just kind of gives a little example from the analysis that was done. And this talks about the use of curb cuts or flush curbs and whether that's allowed. And the items here that are already, the language already included related to this in the zoning bylaw and the site plan and special permit regulations and procedures was recently updated as part of that green infrastructure report that was developed. and so we thought this language actually looked pretty good. We weren't recommending any updates to the site plan and special permit regulations and procedures, but did think maybe the language could be strengthened a little bit or clarified a little bit under the zoning bylaw, maybe to more mimic what was included in the site plan and special permit regulations. And then we did make just one minor edit, or added a slide here related to this item that you guys don't have in your packets, but it also talks about the language that was included in the subdivision of land regulations regarding curbing and burn. And again, we thought, right now it's silent on the use of curb cuts or flush curbs related to green infrastructure, and so we thought, we could add some explicit language in that section as well. So it's kind of just an overall example of how we went kind of through the analysis. So based on the key questions that were asked and posed as laid out in the report, 13 were identified as conventional, 16 as better, 0 as best. But again, in certain regulatory documents, the requirements and the language was adequate, and we did not, recommend improvements. And so overall, the two documents that we proposed improvements to were the zoning bylaw and the subdivision of land regulations. And I just want to say that, we obviously had a sit-down meeting with Evan and other staff from, various municipal departments to kind of go over our initial recommendations in our draft report. And, went through those thoroughly and vetted those with the various town departments. And then kind of updated the report with recommendations that the town felt were, viable and important to kind of move forward with. So there's no real established time frame for implementation of the recommendations in this report. Basically, so the town submits to EPA annually a report kind of outlining compliance with the permit during that permit year. So permit year 4, this report was required to be done by the end of permit year 4, which was June 30th, 2022. And basically in the annual report that was filed with EPA back in September, the town basically laid out kind of the time frame and schedule for adopting the recommended updates that were outlined in this report. But EPA has said that they're flexible on that. It's just, it's a proposed schedule. And if we need to, if it takes longer to adopt changes, then we can certainly, move that schedule out as needed. It's not set in stone, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But this is kind of what the schedule that was laid out and discussed with the town. And so basically making changes again to the zoning bylaw and the subdivision of land regulations. Right now we haven't drafted recommended updates to the regulations, actual language at this point. So that would be kind of the next step after we get feedback from you on some of the proposed updates. But presumably we try to complete a first draft of those updates by the end of January and provide those for internal review and then come back for the planning board again at a public meeting to kind of, go over that language to be able to move forward with adoption of those proposals. Just kind of getting into a little more of the detail and some of the recommendations. So in the zoning bylaw, there was a number of items classified as more high priority, based on our own review and discussions with the town. And one thing we looked at is the table of dimensional requirements in the zoning bylaw. And right now, I believe it includes maximum building coverage, but it seems like there was an interest in actually including more of a maximum impervious coverage for at least multifamily residential, commercial, and industrial zoning districts. So right now, I believe it's at 40% coverage for buildings, but it's silent in terms of other types of impervious area on lots. And so this move would be to create, like I said, a maximum impervious coverage. And we've definitely done kind of some research on what other communities are doing related to this, which we can also provide some insight on as we look to if that's, again, a recommendation that the town is interested in moving forward with in terms of what that percentage might look like. And we can talk about that more. The second item was the size of parking spaces, allowing reduction of parking space dimensions for compact car spots in accordance with MassGov's smart parking model bylaw, which a number of communities have and are continuing to adopt. And so we can also provide some more insight on what that might look like for the town as well. The last item, again, is related to what we talked about previously about the curbs, cuts, flush curbs, just kind of enhancing, expanding on that language a little bit as it relates to, accommodating low impact development practices and green infrastructure. Just moving on to a few more updates on high priority items under the zoning bylaw. The updating the zoning bylaw to explicitly allow the use of pervious parking material. In the case of private ownership and maintenance, I believe right now it is allowed, but it requires a permit. So just seeing if the board would want to kind of streamline that process a little bit, but obviously require the use of a maintenance plan for any privately owned pervious paving areas. The last item on this sheet talks explicitly about green infrastructure practices. Again, this is related to landscaping. Yeah, allowing bioretention areas, green infrastructure to account toward the planting requirements as well. But again, not allowing permeable pavers to account toward that, but allowing other types of green infrastructure to contribute to planting area requirements to promote green infrastructure. Again, some of the stuff that the town obviously may currently allow, but maybe it just wasn't as explicit in the regulations, and so it's just providing that extra clarification and encouragement for its use. There was also some items that were noted as lower priority items, but that we kept kind of as recommendations. The first item was with regard to off-street parking, common parking areas to include a model shared parking agreement, kind of as an example kind of document to incorporate a reference in the zoning bylaw and have that available. Second item was allowing maximum dimensions for loading zones, which aren't currently included. And the last item was including a definition of green infrastructure. Obviously, that terminology has been added throughout the regs and the bylaws, and there's not currently a definition for green infrastructure, so we'll be adding that definition as well. And we provided kind of an example definition here that could be utilized for that purpose. And then we had a few updates to the subdivision of land regulations. The first item relates to dead-end streets, allowing center landscaping with bioretention on dead-end streets in the case of private ownership of those roadways, and requiring the use of a maintenance plan for that. And considering reducing the minimum diameter for dead-end streets and allowing other alternative dead-end street designs as well. And during that internal meeting that we had with the town, a representative of the fire department was at that meeting as well, so there's discussions about what that would look like. And the last item, again, is related to kind of the curb cuts or flush curbs that we talked about before, and just kind of expanding on the low impact development portion of that requirement. So right now it's kind of silent on the subdivision regs, so just adding some language there. And I think that was kind of it that we had for specific kind of recommendation. But I don't know if anyone wants to kind of talk in more detail about some of the recommendations.
I'm just bringing up the report as we're,
Okay, sure.
just some of us are in a room and have the screens on.
Okay.
So as you recall, when Christina was here, and it was mentioned in the presentation, she took the kind of phase one and worked with the planning board and actually brought it to town meeting. And town meeting adopted it. And then after town meeting adoption, we then went into the rules and regulations and updated those. So it was mentioned, this is to continue that effort, drill a little bit deeper down into very specific strategies. Some of these strategies are complementary to the first presentation you heard this evening related to net zero and sustainability. So there may be some overlap and some complementary and things we need to make consistent. I think there's always been sensitivity among town staff over the years and planning board members about compact spaces. We've gone back and forth over the years. At one time, the bylaw specifically allowed compact spaces. We even dimensioned them And then we did away with it because board members thought it was troublesome. At the time, I think large SUVs and trucks were in fashion. Pervious paving is currently allowed, but only by special permit. That essentially was the board's way of introducing it a number of years ago, but not really fully understanding, so a special permit made sense. We have one project in town, it's on North Road, Mr. McCrensky's, I forget the number, the beautiful medical building across from the church on North Road.
Oh, the old,
Yeah, that's pervious back there.
Yeah, completely impervious and
Really pervious?
pervious paving. That's the only one in town that's been permitted and that we're aware of. That particular site was well-suited, it was all sand, so they didn't have to modify and bring in and take out existing material.
it worked for that site.
It worked perfectly, yes. And there's also obviously a variety of other concepts in here, the allowing cuts in the curb seems interesting. But then we'd have to coordinate with conservation where appropriate, or DPW, and figure out whether there are additional concerns related to, water quality and things of that nature, which I mentioned because that appears to be a heightened sensitivity currently. So there's a variety of new concepts that we've been dabbling with. But as I said, and as Jerry said, the bylaws allow them, but we haven't taken any steps to incentivize or encourage. And I think, as you've seen, most of the projects that are coming before you are still using pretty traditional stormwater design, fully curbed, catch basins, and then it goes to infiltration and underground, so that they haven't embraced, at least to my perspective, they haven't fully embraced, low-impact development. And I'm not sure if that's associated with most of our sites are redevelopment, maybe it's more difficult, or if it's a cost savings, or, a cost issue, or a maintenance issue. Juries, maybe you have any insight as to why a community development like in Chelmsford, where it's mostly redevelopment, may be just dabbling with some of the LID techniques and not fully embracing it?
Yeah, I don't think that's uncommon at this point, in terms of what we're seeing in other communities. I guess I feel like looking toward the future, what the real driver is going to be here is some of the requirements under the permit related to nutrient impairments and phosphorus. So a lot of communities, for instance, are the communities that are within the Charles River watershed, they're subject to the Charles River phosphorus TMDL, and they're required to implement the requirements of that TMDL and meet the required waste load allocation in reducing phosphorus discharges in stormwater, through this current permit. And that is going to be a very costly initiative for those communities. And Chelmsford is kind of in a position right now where you're kind of a step behind that, in the sense that you have nutrient impairments related to phosphorus. But you don't currently have what's called a total maximum daily load requirement, which again is an EPA-approved document that outlines, required waste load allocation to be met. So it's very loose at this point. So the town, is looking for opportunities to incorporate green infrastructure and take credit for, what's been done on the private development side and the municipal side. But it's not there's no prescriptive, load that you're trying to meet at this point. But at some point there will be a TMDL, and you'll be required to implement the requirements of that TMDL under a future permit. So I guess from that perspective, I think whatever you can do now to try to encourage green infrastructure in the regulations, I think will only serve you down the road, because I definitely see with other communities, like I said, in the Charles River, that they're just kind of up against this kind of uphill battle to meet this waste load allocation within the next 15 years as part of like a 3-phase plan, and just right now they're trying to take credit for any kind of, infiltration, stormwater management practices that have been installed under the private development side, and on the municipal side, and then making sure the appropriate operation and, maintenance has been carried through as well, with each of the installed, systems. So I think, I think, like I said, maybe it's been slow, but I can definitely see that being the driver to really kind of it picking up, in certain communities, because really the only way to remove, nutrients other than source control is to infiltrate stormwater and prevent it from kind of reaching our receiving waters. So.
Other thoughts, questions, comments?
Well.
So while people are contemplating, the presentation did contemplate bringing zoning articles to Springtown meeting?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think that's aggressive at this point.
Ambitious.
It's very ambitious, yeah, and aggressive, because there are several other items that we're working on. But I believe that timeline is flexible, correct?
Yeah, and EPA
Okay.
actually, they held a webinar back in July about the annual report template that was due in September, and they reiterated that those timelines are flexible, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
But any of the revisions that are in the regulation, we can do as one joint with the sustainability climate.
Right.
So we'll blend that all together as one effort.
Okay.
Are there any examples of other towns implementing all this, Evan? The sustainability,
Yeah.
that we can use it as an example?
Yeah, examples.
Yeah, so I know that the climate thing did look at like Acton and some other communities that are a step ahead of us, and as Jerice
Right.
mentioned here, we may be a step behind.
Are we
a
the
bunch of-
leader or are we following somebody?
We're,
This is the question, Evan.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
yeah,
responsibility right now.
well, Chelmsford, to its credit,
Our
is
leaders.
never an early adopter.
No, what are you talking about?
It's true. They're like we're fiscally.
Well, we're always right, though.
Well, we,
I feel like we're correct.
not being an early adopter has served Chelmsford really well.
Yeah.
Chelmsford doesn't rush into something. They like to wait and see how other communities, so that if there's lessons to be learned, Chelmsford is not making a mistake.
But are there cities and towns like Burlington,
Yeah,
Lexington?
Jerice, can you answer?
I mean,
answer that?
are there examples that we can look at and maybe
Locally,
reach out to
locally
the planning board
comparable,
departments?
Yeah.
whatever.
Shrewsbury, Franklin.
Yeah.
those are
Yeah,
towns.
absolutely, and we're currently working with, a number of other communities, obviously, as well, to make these updates at the same time. So it's interesting to see, kind of how each community perceives the recommended updates and what they want to move forward with. But yeah, and I know, Thea, you already kind of were looking at some examples, and I can certainly, we have some additional slides here. That this was in particular related to the impervious coverage. And so, Thea, you kind of looked at other regulations and what they were requiring. And I think is there more detail? I don't know if there was more detail on the next slide related to that.
Yeah, so here I just have like the current table of dimensional requirements where you have the maximum building coverage, and you guys had mentioned at our earlier meeting that you would primarily be interested in a maximum impervious coverage percentage
Very much so.
for everything except for single and two-family districts, so, commercial, industrial, those zoned lots, in which case there are examples in other communities where sometimes they do landscaped usable open space requirements or hardscape requirements. So there are different ways to kind of do this, whether it's an impervious coverage percentage or it's hardscape, where that just includes patios, driveways, parking areas. So having a requirement for that, or just making it an open space requirement in addition to maximum building coverage. But if you were interested in doing an impervious coverage maximum, it would want to be based off of the building coverage maximum, in which case similar communities that have like up to a 40% building coverage maximum have a 50% maximum impervious coverage is like what I've seen in other communities. But since it's a bit higher here, maybe lowering the maximum building coverage a bit so that you could have that 50 to 60% maximum impervious coverage. It kind of depends how strict you'd want to be. But there are definitely examples in other communities with, different ways to reach that goal of reducing impervious coverage, especially for redevelopment.
Yeah, and if you're interested in what certain communities like Lexington are doing, we can certainly pull that information together. I think, Thea, you looked at like Billerica, Bedford, Woburn. We're currently working with Winchester. But happy to pull, if you think there's a certain communities that you have in mind that you would like to see what they're doing. I'm happy to kind of pull that information together and provide it to the board.
Sure, thank you. As the board knows, the specific challenge in Chelmsford is our redevelopment.
Yeah.
So as you've seen redevelopment sites that come before you where there's little or no landscaping on the site. And then the redevelopment introduces, it's not fully compliant, but it introduces mathematically, it's, 100% more than what was there. So.
It's still minimal.
It's still minimal, right. So as you guys are learning, simply going into the dimensional table and introducing, a max impervious or a minimum open space requirement. When it comes to redevelopment and it comes to your overlays, it's difficult to achieve compliance on any one particular item. If you prioritize compliance with let's say a 20% minimum open space, well, then either you're forcing the developer to reduce square footage of building and/or you're willing to reduce parking. And parking is very sensitive. So this is where the town historically has been challenged internally, what to prioritize. And I think some of you board members have experienced that just, based upon what projects you've sat on. At the end of the day, usually it all works out, compromises, units, reduction in units, and increased landscaping. But when we delve deeper into this, we'll need to make sure that we don't overcomplicate it.
Right.
Understanding kind of our regulatory scheme.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Evan. We certainly don't want to start putting restrictions in here that hamper an investor from upgrading a property.
Right, so I think we've never really focused, the dimensional table serves really well for new development. And as we all know, it's not really used for redevelopment, just because we just haven't had the opportunity to, as I mentioned, get anywhere near compliance related to open space, things, and even setbacks for that matter. So flexibility has been the kind of the zoning strategy, but there may be ways, I think, as the report is suggesting, to prioritize and strongly encourage. And maybe there are situations that the board has, priorities on a project-by-project consideration. And some of those priorities may be based upon environmental sensitivities. Not all projects in town are in wetlands, or some are in aquifer protection. And so there may be other strategies to look to for the board and the staff to prioritize certain strategies.
Yeah, it strikes me the only way you're going to get to 50 or 60% impervious is to require parking garages under the buildings or over the buildings. And that just gets expensive.
I was just going to say too, one thing here too, it's all about, like we talked about allowing LIDGI to count toward coverage requirements. So it's all related to also disconnecting impervious area. So there may be what constitutes impervious area on this site, but if the runoff, the stormwater runoff from that impervious area is being treated and handled through green infrastructure, then that can be considered like disconnected and not count toward the impervious coverage on the site. So in that sense, you're really, obviously also promoting the green infrastructure.
Interesting. So, Jerice,
Get more out of a smaller site.
you had mentioned earlier that this is part of the MS4 permit. And so if I
Right.
understand correctly, it's in Chelmsford, it's DPW, I think the Stormwater Division, who's
Yeah.
responsible for compliance and implementation.
Maintenance.
So I guess, just thinking out loud, it may make sense for the planning board through this process to, as part of implementation, to really sit down with engineering, DPW, to kind of go through some of these numbers, and some of these, strategies, like the one you just mentioned about if you reconnect, then you can count LID or GI strategies. Because they're going to be the ones that are going to be reviewing on behalf of the board and need to monitor and ensure compliance. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think it was great too, Evan, how you had everyone kind of at that initial meeting with fire and already engaging with, fire and police and stuff, which is great because everybody that it impacts, these different departments, it's great to get everyone's kind of feedback to make the best kind of, decisions regarding updates going forward.
Do we have a few examples of different properties that we could meet with the,
Yeah, we can definitely pick a couple.
get an on-site, see exactly what the difference is?
Yeah. I mean,
Help me seeing.
the 50 to 60 between building and parking, 60% impervious, that's probably pretty accurate range for Chelmsford.
Okay.
And generally speaking, I would think that, 10 to 20% of the lot is probably landscaping or setbacks, buffering and landscaping.
Yeah, I was thinking because you guys obviously have a stormwater enterprise in place, you actually have impervious area data
We do.
for all of your, your non-residential, large residential properties. So I'd be interested just to look at that data and see, what do those percentages look like right now?
Yeah, exactly. And as I mentioned, any project that comes before the board is typically redevelopment, and the project is reducing impervious. I mean, you guys have heard all of that. It may be limited, but they're making reductions in excessive parking areas and improving stormwater and things of that nature.
Towards
Yeah.
stormwater.
Okay, was there anything else you wanted to present this evening?
Yeah, I think that was all that we had.
Okay.
Unless there are any other questions. And yeah, just talking about maybe next steps.
Yeah, let me reconvene with you on that, and Courtney, and then we'll report back to the board.
Okay. And what would your report basically be, some drafts?
Yeah, possibly,
That far.
yeah. I mean, I want to sit down and, really digest and see where we can incorporate into the regulations as a short-term implementation, where there's low-hanging fruit within the regulations. Going into the bylaw becomes more involved with some of the
Yeah, and
numbers.
if we're going to do that, we'll probably want to do it all in one place.
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than try to
Exactly, we're not going to
spread
do
it
that
out.
for spring town meeting.
Right.
Okay,
Okay.
all right, great, thank you.
Thank you
Have a
very
great
much.
night.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
All right, we have some minutes.
We have a fourth item, landscape guidelines. This was proposed by Nancy Arroway. Pretty straightforward. Nancy, you want to give a quick, a brief rundown?
I thought we just deferred.
I don't have it in front of me, but basically I can tell you why I put it together. we do a review of landscaping, and we've never had anything that tells the developers what is or what isn't, what we're looking for. And I can tell you that I always find issues, or usually find issues, with the plant material placement, just basically things that are going to cause either safety issues, maintenance issues, or dead plants, ugly dead plants along the way. So, I look for things like, is the plant going to produce materials that fall in locations that cause damage or safety issues? Things like acorns falling on cars, you've heard me talk about a lot. But it's also acorns falling on pathways, because you don't want people walking on something that rolls like a marble. There's the issue of plants that are weedy or aggressive, being put in locations where they're going to take over the landscaping the rest of the landscaping that's been provided. There are issues with plants that are put too close to a foundation line that have highly aggressive root systems and will therefore damage the foundations. So that's the kind of thing that this list talks about. The intention was to put it into the guidelines, not into the regulations, not into the bylaws, but to actually publish it so that we can point developers to some place that says, take care of these things before you bring the plan in.
So pretty straightforward, low-hanging fruit.
I agree.
Yeah.
That we could just do.
Common sense.
We'll incorporate that into the
Yeah,
rules and
get it in the regs,
regulations.
yeah.
Yep, okay.
That was easy.
So we're on to minutes. Looks like there's 3 sets.
All right. I'll take a motion to approve them. Have people had a chance to look them over?
October 12th.
Yeah.
Move to accept the October 12th minutes as presented. Is that the one where Moulton presented his plan for the?
I can't recall the
I
specific
think
dates.
it was. The only thing I would say is that it said I agreed with the applicability, which I did agree with, but I also mentioned that I had concerns about the facade appearing historic and their ability to comply with the sewer.
Yeah, sometimes the minutes don't get
didn't
that detailed.
Granular, yeah. I don't know. I guess it's a fine point. I'm willing to let it go, but.
Evan, I think that it's actually an important point,
No,
is when
yeah.
we do applicability findings, the concerns that we have really do need to get captured and communicated.
They definitely are captured in applicability. But that same level of detail may not be captured in the minutes.
Okay.
We'll make a motion to correct that on that.
Okay. But I don't know which one it is. I think it was the first one.
Then we gotta figure out which one. I gotta do it on my phone.
Past that, I agreed with the rest of the minutes. So can we make a motion to accept them with that modification, given that I don't know which minutes it was from? Sorry about that.
Is it 10-12?
I wrote it down, but
10-12.
was it the 10-12? That's what I thought it was.
I wasn't here, I had them all in.
Yeah, it was, when Phil Iliopoulos was
Okay.
representing.
So amend the
Black Rocks.
10-12 to add your comments to the minutes on architecture.
And sewer.
And what?
And sewer.
Okay, still need a second on the 10-12.
Second.
All right, we got a motion, we got a second. In favor?
Aye.
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 Yep, looks like we got it.
Okay. 10-26.
Move to accept the minutes as presented for 10:26.
Second.
Motion second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Sounds like we're good.
November 9th.
Move to accept the minutes from November 9th as presented.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay,
Aye.
good. Well, we got the minutes cleaned up.
Before we adjourn, reminder, December 7th is the
Yeah.
working group with the water and wastewater, Board of Health, Water Districts, Select Board and Planning Board.
Where's that at?
I don't know,
School-
that agenda will be, school admin, yes.
School committee.
School admin
Yeah.
building, I believe. That agenda should be posted,
That.
I'm sorry?
I think I'm going to miss that. We have
Is
a
it?
annual meeting for the hospital medical staff and annual Christmas party, which we haven't had. This will be the first in 3 years.
You gotta go to that.
And then your next regularly scheduled meeting is December 14th. We
Yep.
tentatively had that opening at 6:30, is what we have.
Well, what do we have in the
busy
queue
day,
for that?
250 Apollo and 270 Billerica.
It'll take a little time.
Okay.
Is 6:30 okay by people? Okay,
It's already dark, why not?
yeah. Okay, then let's keep it at 6:30 and
Meet at
we'll,
4:30?
if we get out early, we get out early.
No.
Okay. Anything else? I want to make one comment. The Master Plan Implementation Committee is underway. We're going to be meeting quarterly. We're going to be looking to the particular chapters of that master plan and looking at one or two of them at each of our meetings. The idea is if we do 2 per meeting in review, then we'll get through a whole cycle in a year. There's also some talk of making it a bit more of a living document. We haven't discussed it in detail, but as we go on through the next 6-8 years, we may want to simply update it when appropriate. We'll talk more about that after we've been through a couple of meetings and done some review. Then, of course, anybody's is welcome to come.
In this building?
Yeah, it's been in this building, well, that's where it was last time. We haven't scheduled the next meeting yet, as far as I know, except for the date, but I presume it'll be here.
Yep,
Are there meeting minutes taken at that meeting? Those meetings or no?
it will be, yeah.
Yeah, they haven't been, we haven't got our
At
first
least
one.
the first couple, see what you guys are up to.
Okay. But we're going to try to be a little more active perhaps than the last implementation committee was. I mean, let's face it, the major function of the implementation committee, it's not to implement, it's to bug everybody else to implement. And that's what we'll be doing.
Going to be official nudges.
Yeah, the official town nudges. There you have it. Any other committees or anything that anybody's been involved with of any grand import? Okay, well, there's always.
Move to adjourn.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Done.
Aye.
Okay,
That was dense.
thank you, everybody.